Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the 2021 edition of the OECD's Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum. This year, we are focusing on the theme Green Recovery, Rethinking the Built Environment and Transport. So day 2 of this conference, today we are starting off with a session focusing on rethinking sustainable tourism. And I have the pleasure to, in a minute, introduce our esteemed chairperson for this session. But just a quick logistical announcements. We do have this event as a bilingual event. So if you're joining by Zoom, please make use of the interpretation. I understand some of our speakers will be speaking in French as well. So we have English and French as the official language for the event. And one more thing, we have participants survey, exit survey, to hear your views on the content and the quality of this year's GGSD Forum. So if maybe you may have received it. If you haven't yet, you will soon be receiving an email and which asks you to take part in the exit survey for this conference. So without further ado, let me introduce Celine Kaufman. We are very fortunate to have Celine. She is the head of our Entrepreneurship, SMEs, and Tourism Division here at the OECD, and she will introduce the session and the esteemed speakers we have today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kumi, and welcome to all to this panel on rethinking sustainable tourism. We'll be together until 12:30 today, and indeed we have a panel of distinguished panelists that I will introduce in a minute to cover the different topics that this issue requires. Just taking a step back and thinking about the topic of today, I think we can fairly say that we all know that the environmental pressures from tourism's contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions ranges between 5 and 8%, with transport accounting for around 3/4 of the total. But we also know that the environmental pressures do not stop there. They also stem from the use of non-renewable and scarce resources, notably water, the production of waste and its disposal, the degradation of landscapes and biodiversity. Sustainability of the tourism sector is central to the agenda of the Build Back Better. And it is a high priority of the OECD Committee on Tourism. It was a core issue that we discussed at the Global Forum on Tourism that we organized a couple of weeks back with Korea, and it is one of the key topics in the G20 Rome guidelines for the future of tourism. So it's really central to the political agenda. But of course, we know as well that the question of how to green the tourism sector predates the COVID-19 crisis. But if it's the case, we also know that the crisis with its staggering impacts, in particular, the decrease in international tourism, which almost came to a halt, is recasting the discussion. One would want to believe that it presents a unique opportunity to rethink the foundations of the tourism economy and move to more sustainable models of development. And I think we heard a lot yesterday in the session on urban transport and city design on how the crisis has been a life-changing moment, in a way, in a big sandbox where new policies can be tested, but also an accelerator of trends. At the same time, we all know how easy it is to revert back to old habits, and there is a risk that if strategic thinkings and plans are not already in place, business as usual will resume. So against this background, the objectives of the session today are to try and identify the priorities in the transition to more sustainable models of tourism development, to discuss the related policy challenges, and to define more clearly what governments can do to enable the transformation. In particular, given the many policy areas that tourism development touches upon, the session aims to discuss the horizontal coordination across different policies, including transport, environment, agriculture, and tourism, obviously, and the vertical coordination across national, regional, and local governments needed for the provision of sustainable tourism infrastructure and services. We know as well that tourism contributes to the livelihood of local communities while impacting their environment in the broad sense. We also aim with the session to understand the measures, how the measures supporting more sustainable models of tourism can also benefit local economies and communities. So to help us navigate the intricacies of the issues at stake, we are joined by an excellent panel of speakers today, mixing various perspectives and country experiences. Let me first introduce the scene setter, Simon Upton, who is currently Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment in New Zealand. Welcome, Simon. Simon used to be as well the Minister for the Environment in New Zealand and to head the Environment Directorate at the OECD. So we know Simon very well. Very happy to see you again, Simon, in this session. After Simon's scene setting, we will move into a panel discussion and allow me to welcome our distinguished panelists. Some of them are joining us remotely today. Some of them are with me so that I don't feel too lonely. First, let me welcome Constanza OLAYA CANTOR, who is the Director for Quality and Sustainable Development of Tourism in the Ministry of Commerce, Industry and Tourism in Colombia. Welcome, Constanza. We are also joined today by Jakob DIETACHMAIR, who is Deputy President of the CIPRA, in French, the Commission Internationale pour la Protection des Alpes. Welcome, Jakob. And by Jérémie FOSSE, Director Eco-Union. And last but not least, we are joined remotely as well by Virginia MESSINA, Senior Vice President, Advocacy and Communications from the World Travel and Tourism Council. Welcome, Virginia, as well. Let me, without further ado, give the floor, hand over to Simon for the scene setting. But first, Simon, maybe can you quickly explain what a Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment is in New Zealand? Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Céline. Well, very briefly, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment is a parliamentary watchdog with complete independence of government to comment on emerging environmental issues. And it's in that context that I've done 2 reports on tourism and its environmental impact in New Zealand. So I'm delighted to be able to contribute to this discussion. There's been much talk since the pandemic about rethinking, or more poetically, reimagining tourism. As time has gone by and sheer survival has loomed larger in people's minds, that enthusiasm may have waned. But I hope not, because there's much that could and should be done. So I'd like to give you a taste of recent history to set the scene and what needs to happen going forward. Next. Prior to COVID, global tourism departures were increasing at an average rate of 3 to 4% per year. The consensus view was that these trends would continue well into the future. The World Tourism Organization suggested that international tourism departures would increase from around 1.2 to 1.8 billion over this decade. Next. A similar picture was painted in New Zealand, with international arrivals doubling between 2002 and 2019, reaching almost 4 million people a year prior to the pandemic. So when I did some research on this, talking to all of the industry and government forecasters, we concluded the country was on track to welcoming between 10 and 13 million visitors a year by 2050. Next. By 2019, that growth was accompanied by an increasingly visible range of environmental and social side effects. And you can see some of them from newspaper headlines on the screen. The typical range of concerns included pressure on some of our treasured natural attractions, freedom campers everywhere, inadequate infrastructure, waste, congestion, noise, and of course the greenhouse gas footprint of the sector. Next. The strategies that were promoted to cope with these pressures included dispersing visitors to different locations to share the benefits, as they said euphemistically, which was also spreading the pressures. Secondly, subsidizing new infrastructure to manage pressures at particular places. And thirdly, private sector information and awareness raising campaigns intended to foster responsible visitor behaviour. Next. Well, of course, we know what happened. COVID put an end to all that. Global travel was reduced to levels last seen in 1990. Next. The effects were even more dramatic in New Zealand. Our border here has been closed to international travellers since the beginning of the pandemic. The last time New Zealand welcomed so few international visitors was in the 1950s, prior to the emergence of long-haul air travel. How's that? Next. Pre-COVID, international tourism accounted for 20% of New Zealand's exports and 5% of GDP. So the pandemic's economic impact has been significant. This slide shows international credit card expenditure across our regions. And you don't need to know New Zealand, just the big bars, the blue bars, those are the big spending regions and those are the big tourist hubs. Next. Now look what happened 12 months later. Spending has collapsed. It's barely visible. But in some regions, domestic tourism activity increased as New Zealanders substituted their domestic holidays for overseas ones. Next. So we can see in some non-traditional tourism destinations, the net effect was an increase in tourism spending. Many Kiwis remarked on how nice it was to visit spectacular parts of their own country, free from the noise and congestion that had become normal. So in a funny way, COVID achieved the visitor dispersal industry planners had talked about as a solution for crowding. Next. So what happens next? Well, the prevailing wisdom seems to be that international travel volumes will return relatively quickly. I think that's probably right. COVID hasn't dulled the reasons why people seek to travel. If anything, it's sharpened them. There's a degree of cabin fever at home. Here's a forecast from the UN's World Tourism Organization. Two things to note. First, as shown by the blue line, international tourism flows have already bounced off their immediate post-pandemic lows, although they're still 67% less than in 2019. Secondly, the current rebound in travel volumes seems to be tracking closer to the more optimistic of the WTO's two scenarios. That's the one where border restrictions were eased and consumer confidence returned relatively quickly. Next. And here's a second longer-term forecast from IATA. It expects the global overseas departures will return to pre-COVID levels sometime in 2023, with continued growth at around 5% per year after that. Next. And exactly the same forecast is being made for New Zealand. It's all going to go back to normal. Next. Now, none of us has a crystal ball, so there may well be some groupthink going on here. Who knows, frankly, what the long-run shape of any recovery will look like. But one thing is certain, tourism won't re-emerge in a more sustainable guise by accident. Building back better to a greener, more sustainable form of tourism will require more than just the development of aspirational strategy documents. Of that, I am sure. In my most recent report, I put forward 3 policy principles with this in mind. Here they are. Next. To treat tourism like any other sector. Tourism has been very good at persuading governments that it needs subsidies for marketing, subsidies for infrastructure. Secondly, develop tourism in terms that are acceptable to local communities, the people who live there. And thirdly, ensure that tourists and tourism operators pay the full costs of the environmental pressures they impose. I'd like to give you a couple of practical examples of what those principles might mean going forward from a New Zealand context. Next. In 2019, flying people around the world generated around 900 million tonnes of CO2. If international aviation was a country, it would have ranked among the top 10 emitters in the world. International efforts to tackle this have been, frankly, feeble. The Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, or CORSIA as it's called, simply seeks to offset any emissions above and beyond that 2019 baseline. So effectively just ignores the 900 million tonnes I just mentioned. To make matters worse, CORSIA has been watered down in response to COVID, a decision The Economist referred to as the defanging of an almost toothless tiger. The bottom line is that at present, airlines and the tourists they serve bear very little financial responsibility for the emissions they produce, but their footprint is significant. Next. Now, geographic isolation means that visiting a distant country like New Zealand is particularly costly from the point of view of the environment. Prior to COVID, international travel to and from New Zealand was generating somewhere between 3 and 8 million tonnes of carbon dioxide each year, equivalent to as much as 9% of our gross national emissions. This graph shows pre-COVID tourism-related emissions for our key visitor markets, classified according to whether the emissions were generated getting to and from New Zealand or generated in the country. And with the exception of Australia, which is obviously a bit closer, simply getting to and from New Zealand accounts for upwards of half the emissions footprint of the entire trip for most regions sending visitors to us. That represents a major environmental challenge, and it's also a major risk for the future of our international tourism industry. Because to the extent that movements like vliegskam, flight shame, catch on more widely, they create a very real threat for tourism economies that rely heavily on attracting long-distance visitors. Next. Emissions from international air travel need to be priced in exactly the same way that those from domestic aviation are in many countries. That would send a signal to tourists about the consequences of their choice of destinations and modes of travel, and it would incentivize manufacturers, fuel refiners and airlines to invest in the development of lower emissions aviation technologies. Now, as I've discovered, pricing international aviation emissions is easier said than done. Next. The first best solution would be an international aviation fuel tax. But guess what? That's been banned since 1944 under the Chicago Convention. And the ICAO resolution, as you can see there, A4019, determines that CORSIA will be the only global market-based measure applying to CO2 emissions from international aviation. Well, the good news is that countries can still impose their own departure taxes. And I propose just that, a tax that's payable by all departing travellers to catch both overseas visitors and our nationals heading abroad for holidays, broadly relates to emissions. You have a higher tax for longer distances or business class as well, and you hypothecate the proceeds to help fund the development of low emissions aviation technology and climate adaptation in vulnerable countries. Next. A second example of what implementing some of my principles would mean involves looking at the way congestion and noise are managed at special places. And in New Zealand, those are outdoor natural scenes. This is a real challenge in New Zealand, where the main drawcard for many visitors is the isolation and untouched wildness of much of the scenery on offer. Of course, it's these very qualities that are at risk as the numbers of visitors and the motorized sightseeing activity that accompanies them increase. Take Milford Sound. It's part of one of 3 listed World Heritage Sites in New Zealand. It was described in the 1890s by Rudyard Kipling as the 8th wonder of the world. This photo is from Tourism New Zealand's website. It's representative of how Milford is typically marketed. Pristine, wild, tranquil, and you're the only one there to drink it in. As the following slide illustrates, the reality can be quite different. Next. Visitor numbers reached 900,000 in 2019. That's a lot at what is, in effect, the end of a very long road with a spectacular view of a fiord. The crowds are accompanied by noise and visual pollution, such as, next, cruise ships. 130 visited each year prior to COVID. Next. There were also 1,000 aircraft landings a month during the peak season, so probably about 50 landings per day in good weather on a little airstrip tucked round the corner. Once overflights are added in, there were as many as 240 planes in the skies over Milford on busy days. It does look nice, that picture, but you can see a helicopter there. Next. The traditional ways of coping with these pressures were, I've mentioned them, dispersing visitors more widely in time and space, and investing in mitigating infrastructure to absorb the numbers. So more car parks, more camping sites, more toilets, rubbish bins, and so on. Both approaches contain the seeds of their own destruction. Dispersal just means spreading the less desirable side effects of tourism to new sites, while infrastructure effectively makes it possible for even more people to visit. Now, an alternative approach would be to establish and enforce limits on visitor numbers that are consistent with guarding the tranquility and wildness of these places. The question is how? First in, first served reservations or price-based approaches? And I know this is done. I've seen it done in Costa Rica very successfully. Now, Milford in New Zealand, which has always been free and available to anyone, is currently the subject of a major investigation. But it remains to be seen if anyone is brave enough to actually limit visitor numbers or significantly reduce the noise pollution. For instance, there's a proposal to eliminate landings by fixed-wing planes, but it's matched by a proposal for increased helicopter landing capacity. So you trade one sort of noise for another. Now, tourism operators will point out that tourism is a more benign use of nature than extractive industries, and I think that's right. But it's a more complicated equation than that. So finding a sustainable balance will require much more than good intentions, and it's good intentions that we need to convert into action. Hence my call for some fairly tough policies. Thank you very much. I hope that provides some challenging introductory comments.
Well, thank you very much, Simon, for the brilliant scene-setting introduction. And I'm sure it will trigger some reactions from our panelists. I could see, and that's the beauty of being in the room with the panelists, them scribbling down during your intervention. On my side, maybe to underline a couple of the key messages that you gave us in preparation of the discussion. The first one related to the fact that there is definitely an urgency, that there is a risk that we go back to business as usual very quickly, and the numbers will resume very fast. So there is now is the time to act to develop more sustainable models of tourism development. The second one is related to some of the very practical suggestions that you provided, also highlighting that it's not going to be easy. Some of the key messages that we hear around notably taxing or reducing the number of mass tourists in a location, that's not going to be very easy to address, and there are trade-offs that we need to consider. And finally, let me highlight again the three key principles, Simon, that you've been underlying during your presentation. First, removing the subsidies that single out tourism as a special sector. Second, involving the local communities more in choosing their tourism model. And I think, you know, the panelists will come back to that and have presentations that support and provide practical suggestions in that direction. And the last one, applying some kind of polluter pays principle to tourists and tourism businesses to account for their negative environmental externalities and for the cost of the services they use, a principle that is very dear to the OECD. Let me highlight as well, in relation to the taxation of international flights, that there will be a session in the forum, session 4, that will actually focus more precisely on aviation and air transport for greening medium and long-term distance transport, where hopefully that issue will be raised. It's again an area where our colleagues at the OECD from the tax area have actually developed some work, and showing in particular that that increasing taxes on kerosene in particular would strengthen the incentives for investment and innovation in clean aviation technology. So there is some work going on in this area, and a full session that will be dedicated to that. If I can turn now to the panelists to react to your introduction and to present their perspective, let me first turn to Constanza to share the sustainable tourism and green recovery policies developed at the national level in Colombia. Please, Constanza, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Celine, and good afternoon for you all. Good morning for the ones coming from this part of the world. And of course, we totally agree with you, Simon, and that's why we working on a new vision to develop tourism in 2019 as part of a long-term tourism goal in Colombia. We started the formulation of the sustainable tourism policy called Together with Nature as a strategic vision for the sector, as it has become evident in recent years, and more so during the COVID-19 pandemic, that developing tourism has to be in a sustainable way, and is both a responsibility and an opportunity for all of us, and especially for Colombia. This policy, Together with Nature, seeks to unite all industry stakeholders towards the goal of developing sustainable tourism in Colombia. And this is both a tribute to and a recognition of the way nature brings us together and makes tourism a memorable experiences in a country like Colombia with rich biodiversity, landscapes, geography, and unique natural resources. We are all responsible for making tourism grow in a way that is better for the planet and allow us and future generations to continue to enjoy Colombia's priceless natural capital. That's why this policy aims to place sustainability at the heart of tourism development in the country, position it as a competitive factor for destinations and tourism businesses, and strengthens Colombian reputation and recognition as a world-class sustainable tourism destination. This consists of a strategic plan to 2030 and is comprised of 6 strategies that has been designed in response to identified barriers on sustainable tourism development. And of course, its implementation timeline is consistent with the global agenda for sustainable tourism. These strategies are oriented in strengthening information for sustainable tourism. Decision-making is a primary goal for us, and without information, it's going to be hard to, go forward on it. The second strategy is building a strong governance framework for sustainable tourism, and we need to incorporate sustainability criteria into tourism planning and management, and coordinate between the sector and environmental authorities. This is a primary goal for us. The third one is promoting investment and innovation in sustainable tourism. Of course, we know that the conditions and incentives for innovation and the use of natural capital in tourism added value proposition is a goal, of course. The fourth one is advancing the business sector sustainable and responsible management of natural capital through the incentivization to businesses and other stakeholders in the value chain to mitigate, control, and offset their negative environmental impact. And there is another one which is very important for us, and is promoting responsible behavior and consumption among travelers. This is to create a sustainable travel culture in Colombia. And the last one is a great impact on positioning Colombia as a sustainable tourism destination, developing and targeting strategic markets. Of course, with the adoption of this policy, Colombia became part of the 12 countries in the world that have a public policy framework for sustainability in tourism, and we have started its implementation with some tools. For example, to start implementing this policy with tourism businessmen and entrepreneurs, we identified there is a need to adequate information, and we need to level up the knowledge of our stakeholders, especially our businessmen and entrepreneurs. That's why we are working with one of our agencies, Colombia Productiva, and we together developed the strategy Colombia Sustainable Tourism, training for tourism entrepreneurs. This strategy has 3 fundamental tools: an e-learning platform, unique in Latin America with practical, digital, and interactive content for different types of tourism service providers to acquire knowledge and skills to implement sustainability practices in their business. To date, we have more than 500 entrepreneurs registered on the platform and undertaking the modules. These are 9 modules, and it contains podcast videos and specific cases of study to become part of the, inspiring the rest of the sector to bet on sustainability in their businesses. Another part of this tool is a manual of good practices in sustainability for tourism entrepreneurs. This contains tools to identify the environmental impacts of tourism, as well as the actions to take in order to mitigate and compensate them. Of course, we need to become more practical, and we have developed workshops in the 32 departments of our country, which is aimed to have a socialization between all of us and create a good environment to the integration of these tools in the sector. Well, in addition, we have already set 5 actions of this strategic plan. Of course, this is a great deal on how we bring good sustainable practices to the sector. So we developed the good sustainable practice guidelines for nature tourism service providers. And this is an incentive for investments on sustainability for the tourism sector, which was included in our tourism law we have adopted in 2020, along with sanctions for those providers who committed environmental infractions. Another part of these actions is that we are working with the United Nations Environment Program and the WWF to design a practical training course on sustainable gastronomy for the tourism sector, with a corresponding guide for restaurant and lodgings. We have just started it, and it has become a real hit among the stakeholders. And in addition, we are also working on the development of an action plan for Colombia to subscribe the global initiative on tourism plastics led by UN, WTO, and the UNEP. And this is part of different tools we have developed in the area of credit. It's a really special area for us. And with our Colombia Development Bank focused on promoting businesses growth and foreign trade, the agency called Bancoldex, we created a special line of credit to finance circular economy projects, bioeconomy, and other tools around climate change management, with the destination of resources such as modernization of sustainable development and energy efficiency and green working capital. all these tools are some examples of tools we have developed, seeking an adequate reactivation of the sector and to keep working around biosafety with confidence, resilience, and different adequate sustainable alternatives. We hope throughout this work, we had chart a path forward for a stronger, well-prepared, and more resilient tourism economy in our country, and of course, to be able to share all of this with our friend countries around the OECD. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Constanza. It's very helpful to understand what can be done at the national level and the focus that you've put on a kind of a golden triangle, the public sector on the one hand with this governance framework that were reinforced, the private sector with all the tools practical tools that you develop to change the behavior of the businesses, but also very importantly, the third part of the triangle, which is the travelers, the tourists themselves, on which you've focused on the responsible behaviors as well. So thank you very much. A very interesting example at the national level. And now I propose that we actually move to a different level, which is both regional and transboundaries. Turning to you, Jakob, so that you can maybe first explain what the CIPRA is, and then go into some of the initiatives that you've been carrying out. Thank you very much, Jakob.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation and good morning to everybody. CIPRA is the International Commission for the Protection of the Alps, and we are turning 70 years next year, and we are strongly committed to the protection and the sustainable development of the Alps. When speaking about tourism in the Alps, we first have to see that there are 8 different countries involved. It's Slovenia, it's Austria, it's Germany, it's Liechtenstein, Switzerland, Italy, France, and what most people don't know, it's also Monaco. So things are rather complicated in a transnational cooperation. But nonetheless, let me highlight some very strong policy frameworks we have in the Alps. So the first one is the Alban Convention, and the Alban Convention is a unique, legally binding sustainability instrument for the protection, but also for the development of the Alps. And within the Alban Convention, we have a framework convention which has been taken place or has been come into effort already in 1995. So within this framework, then you have several protocols or declarations. So for example, it's a sectorial approach. You have an energy protocol and you have a working group on energy consisting of all Alpine countries and observer organizations. You have the same for transport, you have a working group and you have a transport protocol, and we also have a protocol on tourism. Besides that, and this is a rather new approach, we have the Alpine Climate Board, and the Alpine Climate Board is, so to say, you can call it, it's a working group consisting again of all the Alpine countries and the observer organizations. For example, we as CIPRA, we are one of the observers, but also WWF for ALPAC, a network on protected areas in the Alps. And what has been developed within this framework of the Alpine Climate Board is an Alpine Climate Target System 2050, which is again a sectorial approach on how the Alps can become climate neutral by 2050. So there have been targets defined in all of the different sectors with a very visionary approach. For example, in tourism, the aim is really to have a diversified tourism till 2050 or even earlier, or a really low carbon footprint of Alpine hotel and gastronomy. So this is on a very high level till 2050. Then below we have the Climate Action Plan, so I brought it with me today. And this Climate Action Plan has also been elaborated by the Alpine Climate Board and defines very concrete pathways and also actions on how this climate neutrality and climate resilience should be or can be achieved till 2050. But important for the Climate Action Plan, it's more on the short and on the medium run. So action that needs to be taken now. And for example, because I was speaking about the pathways, so one pathway is we have to define a common vision and a common goal on what sustainable tourism in the Alps will look like. Or extremely important, we heard it before, is a realignment of the financial streams. So where does the money go at the end? This is also an issue of the green recovery. So to foster sustainable tourism initiatives and projects. So we have the aims, we have the climate action plan, and then we have so-called communities. So for each of the sector, there have been communities found, one for transport, one for energy, one for tourism. And within this tourism community, stakeholders from all over the Alps on administrational level, networks we have in the Alps, civil society organizations, also youth organizations like Fridays for Futures or Protect Our Winters, they are involved within these Alpine Climate Board communities, and together with them we now develop projects and initiatives on how the Alps can become climate neutral and climate resilient by 2050. So you see, we have lots of very well thought through policy frameworks in the Alps. We have lots of strategies, but what's decisive right now is we really come into action and that we implement these strategies for a sustainable tourism and a sustainable future of the Alps.
Thank you very much, Jakob, for this excellent example of transboundary cooperation that runs from the top, but also to the community level, a very important dimension. And of course, we know pollution does not stop at the borders, so that dimension is very important to take into account. Moving from the mountains to the sea and to my left, if I can give you the floor, Jérémie, can you please first again introduce Eco-Union and the work you're doing on the governance of tourism in the coastal and maritime areas? And I think you're going to partly speak in French and English, so please, the floor is yours.
Merci, thanks Céline. Je vais effectivement parler en français puisqu'il y a une traduction simultanée. Et je pense que nous avons la chance de pouvoir parler plusieurs langues et d'être présent physiquement à Paris. Et en étant plus français, je crois que c'est naturellement que j'utiliserai le français pour ma langue d'intervention. Peut-être expliquer, remercier d'abord l'OCDE pour nous inviter. On est extrêmement content d'être ici. On utilise beaucoup la production, le travail qui est fait par vos collègues, notamment l'équipe tourisme, mais aussi l'équipe d'économie verte. Et on espère aussi qu'on sera capable d'apporter des éléments de réflexion pour travailler sur des politiques qui soient ambitieuses et qui permettent une transition vers le tourisme durable. Donc je suis Jérémie Foss, un des cofondateurs et directeur d'une association qui est basée à Barcelone, en Espagne, qui s'appelle Eco-Union, qu'on définit comme un groupe de réflexion et d'action qui travaille sur les politiques environnementales en région euro-méditerranée. Donc effectivement, on est basé à Barcelone, donc on travaille sur une zone côtière, mais on est aussi très proche d'une zone montagneuse, donc les Pyrénées, et on a aussi pu développer de nombreux projets sur la gestion du tourisme dans les zones de montagne. J'aimerais peut-être expliquer notre point de vue qui est basé sur à peu près une dizaine d'années de réflexion et d'analyse des politiques, à la fois au niveau local, des destinations touristiques, par exemple Barcelone, à niveau régional, donc notamment en Catalogne, mais aussi au niveau international. Et nous sommes aussi observateurs donc, de la Convention de Barcelone, qui est l'équivalent de la Convention Alpine, pour mettre l'environnement et la protection des écosystèmes marins naturels au cœur des politiques publiques dans la région Méditerranée. Et j'allais dire que notre analyse est très similaire à ce qu'a fait présenter Simon, que je salue par ailleurs. Le secteur du tourisme, malheureusement, est peu régulé, n'existe pas en tant que tel. C'est un secteur qui est très fragmenté. D'ailleurs, c'est une difficulté pour les gestionnaires et aussi les analyses socio-économiques qui empêchent d'avoir une vision globale. Donc, je voudrais remarquer l'importance de mesurer et de l'impact du tourisme, notamment sur le changement climatique, les émissions à gaz à effet de serre. Et comme l'a été démontré par Simon, la grande majorité des émissions carbone du secteur du tourisme sont dues au transport, et notamment au transport international qui est celui de l'aviation. Donc il y a une grande difficulté, un grand challenge qui mérite, je crois, d'être posé de façon claire avec des politiques d'action qui passeront probablement par des changements d'habitude, changements dans la consommation du tourisme, avec des séjours qui doivent être plus longs et moins fréquents pour les tourismes internationaux. Donc, je crois que c'est quelque chose qui impacte durablement, qui impacterait durablement les politiques publiques s'il y a un système d'analyse et de prise de décision qui soit basé sur la science. D'autre part, pas seulement la mitigation, mais aussi l'adaptation, et c'est le cas de nombreuses destinations côtières, mais aussi en montagne. L'impact du changement climatique est déjà présent, les aléas climatiques sont de plus en plus fréquents. Il est pratiquement impossible de prévoir les conditions météorologiques à court ou à moyen terme. Et donc ça, je pense que ça impacte déjà durablement la gestion du tourisme, et notamment les infrastructures qui sont malheureusement parfois ont été construites dans des conditions soit très proches de la mer, soit dans des zones de montagne qui sont sensibles aux catastrophes naturelles et qui puissent aussi avoir des difficultés pour offrir les services qui pouvaient être avant, notamment axés sur la neige. Et troisièmement, et je finis avec ce point-là, la régulation du tourisme à l'heure actuelle n'existe pas en tant que telle. Il y a une organisation mondiale du tourisme qui essaye partiellement de couvrir cette réflexion-là au niveau politique, mais dans l'ensemble des pays, on va dire, actifs dans le tourisme, il n'y a pas de politique, ou très peu de politique qui ne soit pas une politique de chiffres basée sur des objectifs quantitatifs. En France, par exemple, l'objectif, c'est 100 millions de visiteurs internationaux en 2020, ça a été repoussé en 2022. Et malheureusement, ce n'est pas compatible, on le sait. Une étude de l'ADEME a été publiée il y a quelques mois qui démontre que l'impact du tourisme sur les émissions à gaz à effet de serre est lié au tourisme international, donc il n'est pas souhaitable d'avoir des objectifs quantitatifs, mais au contraire évoluer sur des objectifs qualitatifs. Et donc, je crois que c'est tout le travail aussi que peut faire l'OCDE, d'apporter des éléments de mesure et de planification qui soient beaucoup plus transversaux et qui aillent au-delà des objectifs économiques, et prennent en compte non seulement la vulnérabilité du tourisme, mais aussi sa dépendance aux écosystèmes naturels. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Jérémie. Et l'appel à l'OCDE a été entendu. Merci notamment d'avoir mis l'accent sur à la fois la fragmentation du secteur du tourisme, la fragmentation de sa gouvernance et des politiques, mais aussi ce que l'on pourrait appeler légèrement la schizophrénie peut-être du secteur, et notamment des objectifs qui peuvent être contradictoires entre la gestion de l'environnement et peut-être toujours une politique un peu quantitative de l'appel à plus de touristes, ce qui a probablement été renforcé par la crise actuelle et l'impression, ou en tout cas la nécessité de faire survivre ces petites entreprises qui font le tissu du secteur du tourisme. Let's now move to the last speaker for the session, who will provide us with a different perspective, a very complementary perspective. Virginia, if you can, if you can, give us the private sector view on how to craft a net zero roadmap for the travel and tourism sector, it would be very complementary to the previous interventions that we had. Virginia, the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Céline, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's an honor to be part of this panel session today. And first of all, I would like to commend the OECD for bringing tourism into such a key forum and more than anything, this very important conversation. So it's a pleasure to be here representing the private sector globally, as Céline was saying. The World Travel and Tourism Council brings together the 200 plus businesses around the world across all different industries. And what we do as part of our core activity is research in terms of the impact of our sector. So if I may, I'd like to start briefly with kind of some of our data in terms of the impact that travel and tourism brings, not just economically, but also socially. So 2019, we were certainly leaving the golden age of travel, as we tend to call it. I mean, our sector represented more than 10.4% of global GDP and created more than 330 million jobs. That is 1 in 10 jobs in the planet. where in travel and tourism. We also know our sector is incredibly diverse. So 54% of women are employed by our sector, as well as youth, and 30% of youth. Now, unfortunately, we all know of the devastating impact that COVID has had, particularly for travel and tourism. So when we look at the impact of the global economy, the GDP dropped at 3.7%, whereas the contribution of travel and tourism to the global GDP dropped by nearly 50%. So again, we've been hearing, and we were hearing some data at the beginning of what the impact has been, which is absolutely unprecedented. Now, we also talk about the social impact, because I think during this crisis, what became clear is that tourism affects more than jobs. It affects people's livelihoods, the community development, the environment, wildlife, biodiversity, and others. And that's why, as such, we have such a key role to play to ensure a sustainable future and recovery. So we most certainly wouldn't agree with the fact that we need less tourism or even to tax tourism more, because according to our data, for every dollar generated in travel and tourism globally, more than 2 are generated on an indirect or induced basis. So this means that twice as much value is generated across the supply chain thanks to travel and tourism. And the same happens with jobs. For every direct job globally, nearly 2 are created on an indirect or induced basis. So again, I'm not going to dwell into the impact of COVID, because we know how significant that has been. And one thing we do know is that definitely public, private, and community collaboration will be integral to global economic recovery. So, and also as we emerge to the pandemic, and in terms of what brings us here today, more sustainable tourism and tourism that contributes to the environment in a more positive way. And that has certainly been a key pillar of our strategy or work for the last couple of years. And Céline was referring to our net zero roadmap. So when we look at sustainability, we know there's different pillars, and there's the climate, the environment, and of course, all the social aspects that we'll also be touching upon today. However, we knew we needed to address climate, and in light of COP26, which happened just very recently, WTTC developed a net zero roadmap for the whole sector by 2050. Now, we did this also in collaboration with the United Nations Environment Programme, which has been mentioned by other panelists. It's backed by the UNFCCC, and we did this in collaboration with one of our partners, Accenture. So what is our roadmap, and what did we find? So effectively, what we did is is run a status quo of climate actions of the sector, identifying roadblocks and decarbonization levers. And we offer a decarbonization corridor for businesses within our examined industries. Now, what did we find? So previous studies, and this is not our data, but we know that what we've heard in terms of travel and tourism contribution to greenhouse gases is between 8 to 11%. So again, certainly, we have an important role to play when it comes to global decarbonization. Now, unsurprisingly, our sector is very diverse, and as such, different industries vary significantly in terms of their footprint. So emission profiles are very different in terms of scope 1, 2, and 3, or direct and indirect emissions, and also, as we know, business models vary so much. So we highlight the importance of these differentiated decarbonization approaches. What we did is analyze 250 businesses, and the other thing we found is that climate targets vary enormously. So out of the 250 businesses, only 42 had a defined climate target. So now out of these, only 20% were science-based. So again, while there's some progress, of course, much more needs to be done. There's also a huge variety of different metrics, target dates, baselines, and commitments. So there's a need for more alignment, transparency, and continuity when it comes to emission monitoring. So again, we try to highlight some of the challenges and we obviously have a call to action. So in terms of the challenges, we need more common cross-industry measurement and reporting of emissions. And that is a key challenge that has come up, again, particularly when it comes to scope 3 emissions. How are these defined? Who's responsible, and how do we measure them? So that's kind of a key action and again a challenge. There is a hugely fragmented and rapidly changing regulatory landscape, which can be very confusing and also costly for businesses and lead to planning uncertainty. There are insufficient external and internal budgets for decarbonization. So it's great to hear for countries like Colombia who are really focusing on this and increasing the financing, because there's a huge lack of government incentives when it comes to decarbonization, and sometimes the lack of prioritization at the business level for climate action as well. And lastly, we need more sustainable infrastructure to support the green transition, such as retrofitting of ports, airports, energy grids, and so many others. So what we are proposing is a three-tiered target framework, where we're basically looking at industries, whether they're harder to abate, and these are obviously the case of cruise and aviation, that are hugely depending on fuel, as we know. There's others that are easier to abate, such as hotels, and then lastly, easy to abate, such as the travel agencies or online operators or tour operators. So what is our call to action? We're calling on businesses and governments, but this is mostly private sector focused, to set baseline and emission targets now and make them as ambitious as possible. So in order for us to achieve 2050 target, and obviously in line with the Paris Agreement, we need to have very clear targets, and they need to be as ambitious as possible, as I was saying. So we need to monitor and report progress. And we need to collaborate within and across industries. And this is alliances, methodological dialogues, such as potentially the one we're having today, and also across the supply chain and with SMEs, because obviously SMEs are further behind, and that's another focus for us. We need further finance and investment that will be required for this transition. And this is understanding the needs both for adaptation and mitigation, and advocating for government support where necessary. And lastly, we need to raise awareness and build capacities on climate, which involve prioritizing climate change within the organizations, investing on human capital and customers, and so on. So those are kind of that's a big call to action from our net zero roadmap. It is publicly available. It's a very, very thorough document. So we are very pleased that we have been able to provide this kind of framework in terms of the decarbonization of the sector. So thank you again, and look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Virginia, for bringing that perspective into the discussion. It's very helpful. In particular, I have to say that you put the finger on one area that was not mentioned before, which is that indeed the tourism sector is made out of plenty of SMEs, smaller companies that actually contribute to the communities, that will be the drivers of the recovery as well, the employment. In the tourism sector, they make out probably for 85% of the firms that contribute to tourism, and they are probably the ones that need to be brought forward when it comes to reducing their emissions. Very often they are left out of existing requirements and regulations, and they are left out from as well some of the training and the capacity building exercises that can help businesses turn their business around. So thank you for that additional perspective. Now we've come to an end to our introductory panel presentations in a way, and we are turning to the questions. I've tried and monitored the chat that is coming virtually through my computer, and after the presentations by the speakers, I have to say that there is a kind of convergence around a number of key questions to the panelists. In particular, I have to say the first one has to do with the dimension of how to really practically ensure that the measures that are being developed to promote more sustainable models of development in the tourism sector can benefit the local economies and the local communities very pragmatically, very concretely, because we know the local communities are the ones that actually may benefit but also suffer from the consequences of tourism. So there is a need for the policies and the measures to actually be very pragmatic in terms of how they can contribute to the local development. So let me a bit randomly ask the panelists to provide their own perspective. I would suggest that you stick to short answers so that we can go through more questions coming from the floor as well. So maybe starting with you, Jérémie, your perspective on the question.
Oui, I will speak in French again. Je pense que ce qui est extrêmement important, c'est qu'il y a des énormes investissements qui sont faits dans l'ensemble des pays, notamment les pays touristiques, pour relancer l'économie. Et malheureusement, l'expérience nous dit que s'il n'y a pas un suivi strict de ces investissements-là, leur impact sera très dilué, voire négatif. Donc je crois qu'il est extrêmement important, et il y a de nombreuses initiatives qui ont commencé à émerger de lancer des exercices de surveillance, de tracking, de monitoring des investissements. On fait partie notamment d'une initiative qui s'appelle le Green Economy Tracker, qui est organisée par la société civile pour analyser la qualité des investissements, et notamment par rapport aux enjeux sociaux, économiques et environnementaux. Je pense on ne doit pas laisser simplement aux États, au gouvernement cette responsabilité-là, mais impliquer l'ensemble des parties prenantes, les communautés locales, les villes, les régions, les entreprises privées, publiques et grandes, et évidemment les organisations de la société civile pour avoir une analyse fine et une accountability, une responsabilité dans la gestion de ces investissements. Merci.
Thank you very much, Jérémie. Constanza, how to ensure that the local communities can benefit from these measures?
Yes, well, getting into account that this is a shared responsibility between the national and local governments, entrepreneurs, businesses, travelers, and consumers, and of course, local communities and residents. We need to promote the greater efficiency and articulation in the relationship between supply and demand. And this is part of the awareness we have to work with communities. They need to know the benefits of tourism in business productivity, territorial equity, and the quality of life of host communities through the specific actions we are working together. The focus on community is manifested through the harmony of productive activities and sustainable use of heritage in a specific territory. This is why communities will be able to see sustainability as a factor of social and cultural development, and they can benefit from that. For example, and this is part of our public policy also, we are working on community-based tourism, including indigenous Afro-Colombian people and other ethnicities, aiming to develop tourism in their territories. And right now we are holding an indigenous tourism meeting with almost 30 different representatives of indigenous communities around Colombia as part of a construction of a roadmap to develop tourism with equity, adequate investment, and proper assessment. And this is a key issue. We are also bringing together cooperation agencies and stakeholders that are working on climate change management, deforestation, greenhouse emission, and other environmental and social issues to work with us, as we have identified tourism can be a great tool for education, conservation, and to create an adequate value of our natural and social capital. Of course, we are integrating this with quality and standards to promote and measure the impact of the sector in these actions we are making all together. And we know there is so much forward to go on the measurement of these actions, and we are creating synergies between different sectors to be able to sum up the different information and analysis platforms and other tools to keep on the duty to create awareness among stakeholders, and especially to bring key information to the table for proper decision making. This is very important for us as a sector. We have to bring all together environment, social education, infrastructure, investment, and we know that we need information, key information, to have a proper decision making on how we work with local communities and the other stakeholders.
Thank you very much, Constanza. Jakob, how do we ensure that the measures that are taken hit the ground?
Yeah, there are two things that come to my mind. I think the first one is that definitely the civil society and the local, the regional and the national, or even the multinational NGOs like us, they have to be involved into the decision-making process. This is also especially true for the Alps, because in the Alps we do not just have tourism destinations, they're also living places for the local population, and they should have a say on what they think about their future or the future of the upcoming generations. So how they want to become sustainably, or how they see the tourism in the future. And the second one is what we experience in the Alps is that there is a lack of knowledge and a lack of governance on who is responsible for what, from the regional to the transnational level. This is also due to the fact, we already heard it today, that tourism is very cross-sectorial. And we had a project, I think about 3-4 years ago, which was supported by the German Environmental Ministry, where we developed a profile for an Alpine caretaker towards sustainable tourism in the Alps. And this profile, so to say, it is a person on the national but also on the regional levels that accompanies the whole industry in really implementing the transition. I mean, for tourism in the Alps, it's the same. It's very much SME structured. We have a lot of family-run hotels. I mean, at the moment, everyone is very much in crisis mode due to the COVID numbers going up, and everyone is scared that the winter season won't happen. So there's really no time for thoughts, because they're really focusing on surviving. But with an Alpine caretaker, accompanying them on really how to implement the shift to a more sustainable business, they can succeed, but they really need to be accompanied, because it's not their core business. Their core business is tourism and not sustainable development. So I think help is strongly needed.
Well, thank you very much, Jakob. We heard a lot, during these 3 interventions, also on the need to track and to monitor. So let me maybe ask the question to Simon. How can we measure the degree of success for sustainable tourism?
Well, thanks, Celine. Very interesting comments from people. I think that tourism is actually extremely difficult to measure. In fact, you have this conversation with tourism operators all the time. That if you say you're concerned about international tourism, they'll immediately say, but look, domestic tourism is bigger than international, so don't just target the international. So then you talk about tourism as a whole. And then people say to you, but listen, it's not so different from the rest of the economy. I mean, look, whether you're a visitor or whether you're a local resident, I mean, you use the bath, you use the toilets, you eat food, you use electricity, you do all these things. It's not a lot different. And of course it isn't. It is absolutely inextricably intertwined. So I think it's a very difficult sector to pick apart the specific impacts that it may have. And so I think general talk and general concern about tourism is often well meant but misplaced. I think we need to be very specific about the particular environmental pressures that it alone imposes. And I don't think that's a large number of things. In a sense, in a country like mine, anyhow, the 4 million who arrive each year, or were arriving each year, in a country with a population of 5 million, so it's roughly almost 80% of the population, it's like having a temporary migration policy. Now, as long as you maintain that level at the same level, it's like building in the extra infrastructure to cope with that constantly higher population than your national population. And a lot of the pressure will be not too dissimilar from that of your local population. Things which are different are obviously around transport and how people spend their time and where they gather. So so emissions from this industry need to be very, very tightly targeted. And for me, the civil aviation side of this is absolutely crucial. We need, I think if we wait for a KO, we'll wait forever. We need a coalition of the willing of countries that really depend on tourism, that want to find solutions, and they need to work together on technology, on synthetic fuel, on trying to manage this issue to find some answers. There aren't any answers right now. They're very, very hard to find, and it's going to take a massive global effort. And so that's why I'm saying, well, you know, why don't tourists contribute through a tax to push those global efforts? Similarly, within countries, there are particular places where there is particular pressure. Again, if we're talking about urban tourism, people going to large cities and spending their time in a casino or in a cafe or whatever, that's not, the pressures are not so different from the ones that the citizens themselves impose. But in a country like mine, where tourism is directed towards the outdoors, the natural environment, then managing the very specific pressures where they occur is crucial, and measuring and monitoring that. My own view is that for the most sought after sites, there should be strict limits on the number of people, because it is the pressure of people that changes the entire experience and also puts pressure on the biodiversity and the place. One thing I found in doing my studies, talking to the industry here and talking to government, everybody said there was a serious lack of data. Everybody said that it was very hard to really come up with good policy. And I'm afraid this is one thing that I don't think governments can stint money on. It's one thing, it's a public good. This isn't a subsidy. They need to know what's happening, and they need to generate very good statistics. And they need to work with the industry to make sure they're asking the right questions in the right way so they get accurate information. Without that, I think we are flying blind. So that would be one of the big conclusions. I don't think there's any disagreement with whether you're in government or in the private sector. We just need better information. And the OECD, I think, could be very helpful if it could reach a consensus about data sets that everyone should be gathering and actually helping people to identify those.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. This is a very lively discussion indeed at the OECD. The Tourism Committee has a working party which is focusing on statistics for the tourism sector, and there is definitely some efforts put into developing more granular information on the tourism sector, including differentiating international flows from domestic tourism, and getting more granular information and timely information to monitor the sector, because national statistics tend to lag a bit behind what's happening on the ground. So that's definitely an area that is very strong. And thank you for putting the finger on the difficulty, of measuring some of these impacts coming from tourism, from the normal activities in an economy. And I wonder on that, Virginia, since you are in the process of developing some social and environmental indicators, how are you taking into account these difficulties and how are you overcoming them?
I mean, I would definitely agree that the biggest challenge is that lack of data. I think that is the biggest problem we face as well. I mean, when we talk about the impact of tourism, obviously we've been doing, over 30 years, we have developed a methodology with Oxford Economics in terms of the economic impact. That's why we can come up with numbers in terms of GDP contribution and jobs. But now in terms of the social impact, that impact in the community. The data is not available. So absolutely, that is the biggest challenge. So we are very aware of that. And I think any efforts to support countries in reporting, in how to better track and measure some of these indicators would absolutely be very valuable for our sector. Now, there's two other elements. So, I mean, we are actually in the process of developing a methodology, but that's more when it comes to environment. So it's more when it comes to emission and emission footprints for the sector, for the various industries, as we were saying, it's such a diverse sector. So, and also kind of measuring against some of the SDGs. But again, we're finding that very little data is currently available. But I think there's another issue, which is also the prioritization of tourism at the government level, because I think that is part of the challenge. I mean, we see that when tourism thrives, obviously there is a structure for this to happen. Just as our sector is very diverse, it's also very transversal when it comes to government. So tourism cannot thrive unless it's having conversations with transport, unless it's having conversations with the environment minister, unless it's having conversations with the social development ministry and many others. So I think so on and so forth. So it's really about travel. I mean, the government's prioritizing and taking travel and tourism as a priority, bringing it in these key conversations to then make sure that obviously all the different programs have a social positive impact across the community and the environment.
Well, thank you very much, Virginia. And maybe rebounding on that last comment, indeed, the discussion has put forward very strongly the importance of coordination across different parts of government, different levels of government as well. So I'd like to ask the panelists maybe to tell us in a minute what they think would be the measures, the actions to foster that cross-government coordination in a very pragmatic way. Maybe starting with you, Jérémie?
Oui, j'en profiterai pour réagir. Je crois que c'est important de préciser que l'absence de données n'est pas une excuse pour ne pas agir. Je crois que c'est important de le dire parce que malheureusement, c'est souvent dans des situations de réflexion qu'on manque les fenêtres d'opportunité. On le voit avec la crise Covid. Le tourisme s'est arrêté pendant quasiment un an et demi. Il est reparti au niveau précédent et malheureusement, on n'a pas encore été capable de mettre en place des politiques qui auraient pu diriger ce tourisme national ou international vers une autre direction. Donc je crois qu'il faut être clair, travailler évidemment, avoir plus de données. On a énormément d'informations, sont très fragmentées, il faut les mettre ensemble. Il faut aussi aller vers des agrégations de données et notamment aller réfléchir sur l'impact positif et négatif du tourisme dans les destinations, dans les communautés locales, sur les écosystèmes côtiers, maritimes, culturels et autres. Donc je crois que c'est un message qu'il faut garder en tête. Et on a des urgences, on a l'urgence climatique, donc je crois qu'il faut décarboniser le tourisme, donc il faut avoir une vraie réflexion sur l'impact de la décarbonisation, comment on le fait. On ne peut pas laisser évidemment ce travail-là simplement au secteur privé ou au secteur public. C'est une réflexion qui doit être, j'allais dire, sociétale, et aussi avoir des objectifs, de mettre en place des espaces de dialogue sur lesquels on puisse fixer des objectifs au niveau des destinations, parce que selon la géographie ou la topologie, les typologies des destinations, les objectifs qualitatifs et non pas simplement quantitatifs seront différents. Donc je crois que c'est l'espace sur lequel l'OCDE peut travailler, donc à la fois avec les gouvernements, mais aussi les régions, les villes et les parties prenantes au niveau local pour ne pas attendre d'avoir des indicateurs magiques qui ne seront pas une solution, mais travailler sur la gouvernance, sur la prise de décision, sur le suivi, l'observation au niveau notamment local.
Merci beaucoup. Jérémie, sur cette question de la coordination intergouvernementale, peut-être je peux m'adresser à vous, Jakob?
Yeah, thanks. I'm totally agreeing to what Jérémie said. I mean, cross-governmental cooperation already takes place a lot in the Alps. We have lots of networks, maybe Alliance in the Alps is a municipality network working towards sustainability, maybe the Alpine Town of the Year Association, which is also a network of the Alpine towns, which is, by the way, hosted by CIPRA, maybe Alpine Pearls, which is also a network that fosters sustainable mobility, or maybe the Via Alpina, which is a long-distance hiking trail from Trieste in Italy to Monaco, and you have a lot of stakeholders and cooperation along the way. But let me highlight maybe one initiative we invented a few years ago when it comes to cross-governmental cooperation. We experienced a few years ago that young people living in the Alps, they know very, very well countries like Spain, they know Italy, they know New Zealand, Colombia, colleagues, no offense, but they don't know their nearby surroundings. And so we came up with the idea in fostering sustainable mobility among youth people with the project YOLIN, which is the abbreviation for Youth Alpine Interrail. And each year, 130 young people get awarded with an Interrail ticket that is just valid for the Alps to experience their nearby surroundings. And the management and the tickets, they are morally supported by all Alpine countries and financed by the German-speaking countries and Slovenia. But traveling around in the Alps for young people, of course, this is great, but what we experienced, and this is the fascinating thing out of it, I mean, of course, okay, we fostered it a little bit, is a community of young people that came out of this Youth Alpine Interrail project. So young people, they want to engage, they want to see how sustainability works out, and what is really fascinating now, they develop their own projects, they develop their own initiatives, and also they challenge us as organization a lot because they need guidance. But I think these are also the future decision makers, and to create this kind of community of people, or if young people who want to get active. So that's a very, very fascinating side effect of a cross-governmental cooperation. And last sentence, these people, they interact with each other no matter where they were born. So there's a collaboration between Slovene, between France people, between Austrian, between Germans, and they really want to preserve the Alpine space and also experience how sustainable development can look like, as it's still a very complicated term.
Thank you very much, Jakob. Investing in the young people, they are the generation of tomorrow. I was wondering, you know, listening to your earlier comment, if too much cooperation doesn't kill cooperation as well, and how it works. But let me turn to Simon, to ask him from his position as an independent witness, how do you see that coordination, cooperation across different ministries happening in New Zealand towards that objective of developing more sustainable tourism models?
Well, there are mechanisms whereby ministries meet together, and it's not difficult in a small country for the government to require ministries with related interests to talk to one another. That has happened, that does happen. Having said that, I was amazed to find that our Ministry for the Environment didn't really take tourism particularly seriously. It was leaving that to other people along the way. But I think that the cooperation problem is probably more problematic between the centre and the local and regional areas. And that really does need to be greatly improved. Let's be frank. There's a big temptation in any country to hand money out to win votes. And if tourism is an attractive industry, if you can come to town with some money to assist, to grow, to assist with infrastructure, you can make a good friend of yourself. And that happens internationally. Now, that's why I proposed as a principle the idea that you shouldn't subsidize things which really the industry, if it grew on its own legs, should actually be funding. And I don't mean the industry, I actually mean tourists. The tourists are the people who cause, ultimately, the environmental pressure. And so let's not keep bagging companies and industries. It's all of us. We're all tourists. If we go to places, then we should have to meet the costs that we impose. Now, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be public money, because not every externality can be priced. You've got to do some things collectively. But I think the challenge for governments is to say, if you're going to hand money to local and regional communities in working with them, insist on conditionality, that no money can be spent in a way that pulls in the wrong direction. And so in other words, infrastructure, which is going to lead to higher emissions or more waste of water or more physical waste, should not be being funded. There should be no public money behind that. And so it's finding the ways to talk to communities to say, yes, we are here to help, but the help has to be consistent with looking after the environment, and also talking to those people about what it is they want from tourism in their country. I think those are very difficult. These are sociological and governance issues. That's not my remit, really. I'm supposed to be there standing up for the environment. But I think if you can't get people on side and engage them in what will look after their local environment, you won't make a lot of progress. So that's where I think I'd put my focus, Céline. It's on building really good links to the communities that welcome visitors.
Thank you, Simon. And I was wondering, Constanza, from your perspective in Colombia, how did you solve that issue as part of your 6 strategies? How did you manage to bridge the cooperation with the local authorities, with the communities?
Well, actually, as part of our development plan, we have a strategy called the Integrated Destination Management Strategy in order to do this cross-government coordination. And I must say, it is working well to create adequate communication and dialogue and engagement. This strategy is related to the systemic planning, and management of activities. Of course, we bring all together activities, resources, stakeholders. We are working on involvement in the development of the tourism in the specific territory. It includes the definition, execution, and follow-up of policies aimed at facilitating the consolidation of any specific destination. We work with destinations in accordance to its territorial context, its level of development, as well as the bottlenecks or problems that each destination is facing. The importance here lies on the articulation between the demand and the supply. So we must coordinate between local governments, stakeholders, private sector, and communities in order to guarantee sustainability. All these activities are carried out in an integrated destination management strategy, seek to respond to the planning needs of tourism activities in their territories. But why this is so important, to generate strategies to coordinate all the actors? Well, because in this way we can generate value, differentiation, and quality of the tourism offer based on cultural and biological diversity we have in the country. In this way, we intend to generate diversification and specialization of the country's tourism offer, improving the integration of the territories as corridors, tourism corridors, and as well as an increase on the occupancy rates and in accommodations with greater use of tourism services and attractions. Under this strategy, we generate action plans for public and private articulations, and we create this whole process. We carry out an input stage where we identify with the stakeholders in the local level of problems and opportunities of each corridor. And then we carry out the process where we define the actions and solutions with regional impacts that are aligned with the actions of the national sectoral plan. And this is a very important dialogue, coordination, and articulation between actors, national entities, governors, mayors, unions, cooperation agencies, investors, and the whole ecosystem of the sector within the territory. And then we look for results. At the resource stage, we have a comprehensive destination management process in coordination with the public and private actions that we are developing and are taking place in the territory. And then as part of the monitoring and assessment, we have the impact stage, where we measure the improvements and competitiveness and innovation, but you know, like the nodes we can observe within the territory. And of course, this is a big challenge for us, and especially with the information, with the data Virginia was saying. There is something that, you know, local regional entities and also us from the national government, we are not used to generate a proper data to decision making. So we are in the road of capacity building to be able to bring data into this working map. And of course, we know it is a big challenge, but also a great opportunity for all of us to keep moving forward on this cross-government coordination.
Well, thank you very much, Constanza. We're coming to the end of this session, but before wrapping up, I want to give quickly the floor to Virginia on this coordination issue and involvement of the private sector. In 1 minute, Virginia, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with everything that has been said. I mean, we've done a lot of work in terms of destination management, and obviously pre-COVID in terms of destination stewardship, and some of the best examples are absolutely models that include the public sector, the private sector, and the community. So I think that kind of summarizes everything that we've been saying. That is definitely sort of the way forward. Now, I would also like to add, because I've already talked about cross-government coordination, there are mechanisms to make that happen. I think it's when big things happen, when big decision-making discussions are happening, where we would try to have tourism at the table. But there's also the element of kind of coordination across government. So it's not just within the government, but also, I mean, unfortunately, the lack of harmonization and coordination that we've seen through the COVID crisis has made the impact much deeper, and it's probably gonna then also make the recovery longer. And we need more coordination across governments within the regions, but also ideally globally. So I would leave it at that, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Virginia, and those are very good words to end the session. There were a lot of ideas that were put forward, and definitely the issue around the data need, the importance of more granular information and developing meaningful indicators will be something that we will carry forward in the OECD. Let me finish by thanking all the panelists, the scene setter, and the panelists on site with me and connected remotely. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and thank you very much for the insightful interventions. I will stop here, but I want to remind the audience that the forum will resume this afternoon at 1:45 for a session on energy efficiency and the built environment. So please come back after the lunch, and I wish you a very good day. Thank you.